David and Goliath, A Journey of Faith, based on 1 Samuel 17. Prologue. A story meant to be heard. This is not just a story about a boy and a giant. This is a story about courage, a story about faith, a story about how one moment of trust can change the course of history. Tonight, as this story is read to you, let the world outside fade away. Let the noise grow quiet. Let your mind step into the land of Israel. Long, long ago. A time when kings wore golden crowns. A time when shepherds walked among quiet fields. A time when the voice of a single boy could silence the roar of a giant. This is the story of David and Goliath. We are now at chapter 1. The Shepherd Boy. The air in Bethlehem was still cool in the early morning. A gentle wind brushed through the fields, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp earth. The sun was slowly climbing over the hills, painting the sky with gold and soft pink. Birds sang their first songs of the day, and sheep bleated softly in the distance. In the middle of this peaceful land walked a boy named David. His steps were light, almost dancing as he led his father's sheep to fresh green pastures. He carried a shepherd's staff in one hand, and a sling rested at his side. On his shoulder hung a small pouch filled with smooth stones he had carefully chosen from the brook. David's hair was touched by the wind, his eyes bright with curiosity and joy. He was young, smaller than his brothers, but there was something in him that no one else could see. Something strong, something deep. David loved the quiet. He loved the way the hills seemed to listen. He often sat on a smooth rock near a grove of olive trees, took out his harp, and began to play. His fingers danced on the strings, and his voice rose into the sky. He sang songs of love, songs of praise, songs of trust in God. While the world saw just a shepherd boy, heaven saw a future king. David's father, Jesse, was a respected man. He had 8 sons, and David was the youngest. His older brothers were tall and strong, men who had joined King Saul's army to fight against Israel's enemies. David, however, spent his days among the sheep, learning not the art of war, but the art of listening, to the wind, to the earth, and to God. But even in the peaceful fields, David faced dangers. Wild animals roamed the land. Lions and bears sometimes came to snatch away a sheep. David had learned to fight with courage and skill. When danger came, he ran toward it, not away. He struck the beasts down with his sling and his staff, trusting that the Lord would protect him. And every time, God did. One night, as David watched the stars, he whispered, "The Lord is my shepherd. I will not be afraid. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not fear, for He is with me." He did not know it yet, but these quiet nights were preparing him for something far greater than tending sheep. The boy who sang under the stars would one day stand before a giant. We are now moving on to chapter 2. A Nation in Fear. Far from Bethlehem, the quiet hills gave way to the roar of war. The Philistines, a powerful enemy, had gathered their army to fight against Israel. They marched with shields of iron and swords that shone in the sun. Their soldiers were fierce and disciplined. The Israelites, led by King Saul, gathered their own army to meet them. The two forces stopped in the Valley of Elah, where 2 great hills rose on either side of a wide, open valley. One army stood on one hill, the other on the opposite. The wind carried the sound of shouting and the clanging of weapons. But between these 2 armies stood something that froze the hearts of men. From the Philistine camp came a single warrior. His name was Goliath. Goliath was unlike any man they had ever seen. He was a giant, over 9 feet tall. His armor alone weighed as much as a man. A bronze helmet covered his head, and a thick coat of metal scales wrapped around his chest. The spear in his hand was massive, like the trunk of a small tree. The iron tip of the spear glinted in the sun, heavy and sharp. And when he spoke, his voice was like thunder. "Why do you come out to line up for battle?" Goliath roared. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose one man to come down to me. If he kills me, we will become your servants. But if I kill him, then you will serve us." His laughter echoed across the valley like a storm. The soldiers of Israel trembled. No one dared to move, not even Saul, their tall and handsome king. Goliath repeated his challenge every morning and every evening for 40 days. Fear grew like a shadow over the camp. Some soldiers whispered, "He is too big." Others said, "No man can defeat him." Some prayed in silence. Some lost hope altogether. Goliath mocked not just Israel, but the God of Israel. His voice was an insult, echoing into the night, shaking the hearts of men. And so, chapter 3. David arrives at the battlefield begins, back in Bethlehem. Jesse sat near the fire and thought of his sons at war. He called for David. "My son," he said, "take this roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers at the battlefield. Take these cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are doing, and bring me word." David woke early the next morning. The stars were still faint in the sky as he handed the sheep over to a caretaker. He placed the food in a sack and began his journey to the valley where the armies waited. The road was long and dusty, winding between hills and fields. David walked with a steady pace, the songs of the morning still in his heart. When he reached the camp, he saw the soldiers lining up and shouting their war cries. Trumpets blared, spears clashed, but just as their voices rose, they suddenly fell silent. The giant had stepped forward. David heard Goliath's booming voice for the first time. It rolled through the valley like thunder. The young shepherd watched as grown men, warriors, backed away in fear. David's heart burned inside him, not with fear, but with righteous anger. He turned to the men near him and asked, "Who is this man who defies the armies of the living God?" The soldiers told him about the reward Saul had promised: great riches, the king's daughter in marriage, and freedom from taxes. But David's eyes were not on the reward. His eyes were fixed on the insult to his God. When Eliab, his oldest brother, saw David talking, his anger flared. "Why have you come here?" Eliab snapped. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness?" "I know your pride. You just came to watch the battle." David looked at him calmly. "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" His words spread through the camp. Some laughed at him, some shook their heads, but some wondered, who was this boy who spoke with such courage? Soon the news reached King Saul. We are now moving on to chapter 4. Standing before the king. The soldiers around David whispered and pointed as he spoke boldly. His words traveled quickly from tent to tent until they reached the ears of King Saul. The king, who had been silent and troubled for many days, sent a soldier to bring the young shepherd boy to his tent. David stepped inside the royal tent. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and iron. Soldiers stood silently on either side of Saul's chair. The king looked tired. His armor lay to the side, untouched. His eyes were shadowed with doubt. Before him stood David, barefoot, dusty from the road, his shepherd's staff in his hand, and his sling hanging from his belt. He bowed respectfully. Saul looked at him with surprise and said, "You cannot go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David stepped closer. His voice did not shake. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," he said. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and killed it. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." The tent fell silent. Soldiers exchanged glances. Some frowned in doubt. Others were moved. But Saul saw something that no one else saw. It wasn't strength. It wasn't size. It was faith. Finally, Saul said, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul ordered his men to bring his own armor. They placed a bronze helmet on David's head, strapped a heavy coat of armor onto his chest, and fastened a sword at his side. David tried to walk, but the armor weighed him down. He could barely take a step. The sword dragged at his hip like a burden. He shook his head slowly. "I cannot go in these," David said. "I am not used to them." He removed the armor piece by piece. The king watched in silence. The soldiers whispered. Who would face a giant with no sword, no shield, and no armor? David tightened the strap on his sling and adjusted his pouch. He stepped out of the tent with nothing but faith, just as he had walked through the hills of Bethlehem 100 times before. Outside, the sun was climbing high. The heat shimmered over the valley. The air was tense. Soldiers on both sides watched as the shepherd boy walked down toward the brook. We are now moving on to Chapter 5, Facing the Giant. The brook was shallow and clear. David knelt down and dipped his hands into the cool water. Smooth stones rested beneath the surface, shaped by years of flowing water. He picked up one stone, then another, until he had 5 perfect stones. He placed them in his leather pouch, stood up, and turned toward the battlefield. On the opposite hill, Goliath was waiting. His armor glinted in the sunlight like fire. His shield-bearer walked before him, lifting a massive shield that seemed more like a wall than a weapon. Goliath stepped forward, each step thundering through the valley. As David walked toward him, laughter broke out from the Philistine camp. "They send a boy," one soldier mocked. "A boy with sticks." Another laughed so loudly that the sound rolled across the valley like wind. Goliath narrowed his eyes as David came closer. He looked at the boy and his simple clothes. He saw no sword, no shield, no armor. Only a sling and a staff. "Am I a dog," Goliath roared, "that you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by the names of his gods. His voice was a storm. His laugh was cruel. Then he shouted, "Come here, boy, and I will feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the field." David stood his ground. The wind tugged at his cloak. His heart was steady. His voice was clear. "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin," he said. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." Goliath let out a roar of rage and began to charge forward. The Philistines cheered, believing victory was already theirs. David began to run too, straight toward the giant. He reached into his pouch and pulled out one of the stones. With practiced hands, he placed it into his sling. He swung it around once, twice, 3 times. The sound of the sling cutting through the air echoed through the valley. The stone flew like lightning. It struck Goliath in the center of his forehead with a sharp crack. The giant's eyes widened. The roar died in his throat. His knees buckled. And then, like a great tree falling, Goliath crashed forward onto the ground. The valley that had echoed with his mockery was now filled with silence. David ran forward, climbed onto Goliath's chest, and pulled the giant's own sword from its sheath. The sword was heavy, but David lifted it with strength not his own. He struck down the enemy that had terrified Israel for 40 days. Goliath, the mighty warrior of Gath, was dead. For a moment, no one moved. And then the Philistines screamed. Terror spread through their ranks like fire through dry grass. They turned and fled. The army of Israel rose as one and shouted with victory. They chased the Philistines far beyond the valley. We are now moving on to chapter 6, Victory and Celebration. The sound of battle faded into the distance. The once terrified soldiers of Israel now marched back through the valley, their hearts burning with triumph. David walked slowly toward the camp, his clothes stained with dust, his sling still hanging at his side. He carried Goliath's massive sword and the proof of his victory. As he entered the camp, men stepped aside, watching him with awe. No one could believe what they had seen. One boy had faced a giant. One boy had changed the course of a nation. King Saul waited for him at the entrance of his tent. David bowed his head and said nothing. Saul stared at him for a long moment, then asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David lifted his eyes. "I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem." The king nodded slowly, as though understanding that something greater than war had just taken place. This was more than a battle won. It was the beginning of something bigger than any of them could imagine. That night, Israel sang. Drums beat, flutes played, and women danced in the streets of their towns. The soldiers lifted their voices and chanted, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." The name of David spread like fire through the land. But David himself did not boast. He walked quietly, his mind still on the moment in the field, the sling in his hand, and the voice of the God he trusted. He knew the victory did not belong to him. It belonged to the Lord. We are now moving on to chapter 7. The message lives on. Years passed after that day, and David's name continued to rise. He would one day become the greatest king in Israel's history. But the story of his courage on that battlefield would be told for generations. Parents would tell their children. Kings would remember. Soldiers would draw strength from it. And so tonight, you have heard it too. But this is not just a story about a shepherd and a giant. This is a story about what happens when fear meets faith, when doubt meets courage, when one small voice stands against the roar of the enemy and says, "God is greater." Goliath was tall, strong, terrifying. He mocked God. He made armies tremble. Yet he fell, not to a sword or a spear, but to the faith of a boy who believed. David did not compare his size to Goliath's. He compared Goliath's size to God's power. And when he did, the giant suddenly didn't seem so big anymore. Every person faces giants. Giants of fear, pain, doubt, shame, or the past. Giants that speak loudly, trying to make you believe you cannot win. But like David, you can stand firm and say, "The battle is not mine. It belongs to the Lord." God does not need perfect people. He needs willing hearts. He doesn't look at how tall you are, how strong, how powerful. He looks at your faith. And when you trust him, giants fall. David walked onto that battlefield a shepherd. He walked off a warrior. But the true hero was God. He gave strength to the weak, courage to the fearful, and victory to those who believe. And so this story remains. A story for every generation. A story for anyone who has ever felt small. A story for anyone who has ever faced something too big to handle alone. You are not alone. The same God who stood with David stands with you. Giants still fall. Faith still stands. God still wins.